I've got to leg it after 8, unfortunately, but it's great to see so many people here at the Putney debates. And what an appropriate title, what an appropriate homage to our great history, great tradition of struggle. And it's a tradition that those in authority want us to forget, because it's a subversive history. It's a reminder that the way change happens isn't because the powerful wake up one day and think, ooh, I think I'll give some basic rights to people. I think I'll give women the vote. Instead, people with courage, and determination and unity have to link up together and force the powerful to concede. The Putney debates is fascinating because the French Revolution is a very famous incident, a very famous episode in history, which is often debated and discussed. But we often forget we had a revolution in this country too, 150 years or so before the storming of the Bastille. And there you had the likes of the diggers and the levellers flourishing before their time, in the sense they were debating democracy, they were debating forms of socialism, long before these ideas became completely mainstream. And the Putney debates, you got the new model army of the mobilised people fighting against the monarchist forces. And they were supposed to simply be the kind of tool of relatively the privileged elements who were fighting not for a republic originally. They were fighting, though, to trim the powers of the king, but these were privileged elements themselves, and they expected the army fighting that war to be obedient and subservient to them. But they unleashed this Pandora's box, and the people who fought so courageously against monarchists, the royalist forces, they felt that if we are going to die for this cause, if we are going to risk our lives for it, then we have the right to debate the future society that can come after the end of this war. And so we got there, the flourishing of ideas like democracy. And that's the kind of history of our country, which we forget. We forget it too often. We forget, going back to the 14th century, the Peasants' Revolt, when a poll tax was then imposed under an unpopular king who was surrounded by hated advisors. And what happened was peasants and people from kind of ale tasters, people who worked on the land, people all over the country, they marched on London from Kent, Essex and so on, and these were coordinated waves of people, and they were fighting against the shackles that remained of feudalism in England. And actually women played a decisive role, the likes of Joanna Ferrer, who was one of the leaders who was attacked in the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt. And when they assembled in Blackheath on the outskirts of London, there was this Lollard priest, a dissident priest called John Ball, and he questioned in front of the assembled peasants who'd gathered the very existence of a class system. He said, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? His belief was that the idea of class division, of gross inequality, wasn't a natural state of humanity, but it had been introduced, that it wasn't how humans naturally lived, and therefore it should be abolished. Very subversive for the 14th century in England. And of course, if we go on through the decades, through the generations, through the centuries, the Chartists, the world's first great working class political movement, who fought, whether it be those who believed in physical force, those who believed in more peaceful means, whether it be the Newport Rising, for example, where people took up armed insurrection against the authorities, but these were people fighting for democracy. They organised their own newspapers and so on the basis of giving working people a political voice. There was the Tolpuddle Martyrs of the 1830s, when agricultural workers in Dorset, they assembled an early trade union to defend their rights against their the landlords of the time. And because of that, they were transported to Australia as punishment. But actually, this incident galvanised people. It triggered one of the first great political demonstrations in the history of this country. Hundreds of thousands of people signed a petition demanding their return, and indeed, they achieved that, which was an early victory for a nascent trade union movement. And then, of course, there are other trade unionists throughout the 19th, early 20th century who fought at great cost, with great courage, for the rights and dignity of working people, often with legal attacks imposed by a political elite which existed to serve the wealthy, which is very unfamiliar to all of us, and that imposed these, made trade unions liable for any losses incurred during strikes, which obviously in practice prohibited strikes, because the idea was if you went and took strike action, then any dents to the profits of the company as a result, you had to pay for them. And this was overturned because trade unionists fought. They fought together with determination and courage. And then, of course, the suffragettes. Now, we think of the suffragettes now, they've almost become folk heroes. Nobody has a go at the suffragettes these days. They're universally lauded. Not so at the time. At the time, they were reviled. They were reviled as terrorists and anarchists. Who and this is the thing, you know, it just shows change doesn't happen because people politely ask for it. And in the case of the suffragettes, well, you can see that. They were, you know, Manchester Art Gallery was famously trashed by suffragette activists in 1914. And the political elite and the media elite threw everything at these people. And these suffragettes were, you know, they didn't just chain themselves to buildings. They took part in all this direct action, and they were locked up in prisons, and they were force-fed because they had the audacity to fight for the basic right of women to have a voice. And then we could go on, those who fought sexism, racism, homophobia, battened in the streets, spat at, reviled, treated with total contempt. Those who fought for the welfare state, for workers' rights, for the National Health Service, all things, again, which people had to organise for at great cost, with the powerful, by definition, those obviously dominating society, sneering at them, ridiculing them, leaving them completely marginalised. And yet, of course, in the teeth of opposition from those with power who dominate society, the likes of the welfare state and the NHS were won. And that's the lesson we've always got to learn, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. That everything we have, all the gains, all the rights, they're not just handed down, they're not handed down from those above, they're won by our ancestors. And therefore it's not for us to allow everything they won at such cost be taken away from us. That's why we have to keep fighting. That's the great tradition in which we stand, a tradition which is all too often ignored. And you don't have to go back way into history. You know, take the movement against the poll tax. I was actually taken by my parents at the age of 5, which is probably a surprise for those of you thinking about 10. But I was taken there when I was 5. I didn't know what we were chanting about. Me and my twin sister were given a placard or a A5 flyer to hold because we felt left out. Everyone had these big placards, and I started chanting what was on it and started a chant, which is still my proudest political moment. I have no idea what I was chanting. But that movement, people marching in Scotland, in England, in London, famously, down the road, but people as well engaging in civil disobedience because people refused to pay that poll tax, regarding it as unjust, the rich and poor alike having to pay the exact same amount of money. But they didn't just get rid of the poll tax. That movement helped boot Margaret Thatcher out of number 10 as well. There's more recent examples, whether it be those fighting against the bedroom tax. Cruel, unjust, vile policy. A policy which forces predominantly poor disabled people to cough up money they don't have, or to downsize to smaller properties which don't even exist. A woman got in touch with me, she had a disabled daughter. Her disabled daughter died, thus she had a spare room, thus she had to pay the bedroom tax. Now, people at the beginning of that policy thought, we won't be able to win this. It's too hard. Look at the polls. Look how demonised people are who rely on social security. But they took to the streets, they had heart. And they gave a platform to those affected. And they not only won over public opinion, they effectively got that bedroom tax repealed in Scotland, and they forced the Labour leadership to commit to repealing that bedroom tax if they were to win the next election. That's people-bound action. That's what happens if people organise. It's the same UK COP. Who was talking about tax avoidance a few years ago? It was an issue which just languished on the fringes of political debate. But because people took direct action, in the great tradition of this country of which I spoke before. They occupy shops and businesses engaged in tax avoidance in a society where £25 billion is lost through tax avoidance each year as the welfare state is attacked, as cuts unseen for a generation are imposed. And they forced that issue onto the agenda. They forced the media and politicians to fall over themselves to talk about tax avoidance. And we could go on, we could talk about the electricians who went on strike in 2012 against Balfour Beatty, one of the great multinational companies, and they didn't just go on strike, they took part in occupations as well, and they won. They stopped Balfour Beatty attacking their terms and conditions and their pay and their lives, and they won. And I think of in 2009, a Tory Lib Dem council tried to cut the wages of bin workers who went on strike, and they went on strike for 7 weeks. In freezing cold temperatures, it was winter, and they got up every day at 5 AM to man their pickets, and they won. And that shows taking action isn't simply about letting off a bit of steam, saying at least you gave it a go, at least we didn't just sit around even though we face inevitable defeat. That's not what protest has to be about. And the point about our history is it shows that it is by definition called a struggle for a reason. It's not a walkover. Battles can be lost even though the war in the end is won. And it means, if you look at our history, people often felt they were going to lose. They faced what seemed like insurmountable odds. They were against powerful people who had all sorts of means at their disposal to prevent ordinary people from winning. And these divisions are often exploited. But if they can win, we can win as well. And what they try and do is they try and get us to be angry with each other all the time. That's their whole ruse. It's the politics of envy. If you're struggling, you should envy your neighbour instead of being angry with the powerful, that if you're a low-paid worker, your wages being cut by your boss in real terms, your in-work benefits being slashed by the government, that instead of being angry with your boss, instead of being angry with the government, you should envy the unemployed person who's living it up in luxury down the road. If you're in the private sector, pensions decimated by bosses, one of the great scandals of our time, you shouldn't be angry with your boss, you should envy the nurse or the teacher or the other public sector worker whose pension is still intact. And if you're someone who can't get an affordable home because council housing has been so attacked by successive governments, or you can't get a secure job because they've been stripped from our economy by economic vandalism over the last generation or so, you shouldn't be angry with the powerful, you should envy the immigrant getting the job or the home that should rightfully be yours instead. And that's what we've got to fight against. We've got to give people hope. The likes of UKIP, this anti-establishment party led by that rare breed of politician, a white, privately educated man who worked in the city as a broker, whose anti-establishment party is bankrolled by Tory millionaires, whose policies are so unique and stand out from the political establishment because they call for these unique policies like privatisation and slashing taxes on the rich and attacking workers' rights. We've got to remind people, we've got to say to them this: who caused this crisis? Who plunged this country into economic disaster? Was it the Polish fruit picker? Was it the Lithuanian nurse? Was it the Indian cleaner? Or was it the bankers who plunged us into economic disaster? Is it the tax dodgers who hoard £25 billion a year while you have to pay every penny? Was it the poverty-paying bosses who leave most people in poverty languishing? Most people in poverty in work, earning their poverty day after day. So we've got to give people hope, and that means drawing on our traditions, drawing on the traditions of people who fought back at great cost, and that means fighting for a living wage for all in work, fighting for councils to build housing, having the renewable energy jobs of the future instead of zero-hour contracts and unpaid or low-paid work, or the cycle of unemployment, tax justice, forcing the people at the top to pay the money they should be paying instead of mass tax avoidance and low taxes on those people. Utilities not run by profiteers but run by the people of this country democratically, like railways and energy. Proper workers' rights, so working people can stand up for themselves. These are the things we should be fighting for. And just finally, have hope, have courage and determination. The likes of Occupy forced onto the agenda this central defining issue of our time. This is the central defining issue of our time. Who caused this crisis? Who's been made to pay for it? Who is booming whilst others are struggling? In the last 5 years, the wealth of the top 1,000 people has doubled, whilst up to 1 million people depend on food banks in the 6th richest country on the face of the earth, unable to feed themselves. That's what Occupy put on the agenda, but it's up to all of us to solve it. So let's link together, learn from the traditions of this country, and know that the way we get change isn't by politely asking, but it's by organising together, using our collective strength. If our ancestors could win, we will win as well, and we will build a society running the interests of the people who keep it ticking, not those people at the top.